Thanks very much to all our speakers, to Silviya, Tom and Ben, who are now all available for questions. We've had already had some good questions come in. Let me start with a question for Ben, which might also go to Silviya as well. Ben, you talked about various DRT and other initiatives. Do you foresee that most, if not all, sparsely populated or rural areas will eventually have a good public transport network through DRT or these other initiatives?
Yes, it's a great question, and I think ultimately my belief is the answer to that is yes. If I speak as a supplier to that type of scheme for a moment and say, one of the challenges we face is that we can't always see the demand in those areas before we put supply in. Second is when we put supply into that area, we need to create visibility to that supply as well so that it actually gets used. As Enterprise, we're quite fortunate that we're a global brand with good visibility digitally. So we find when we put our products and services in there that they get perhaps even more use than they might do in an urban area because alternatives are quite sparse. But that's where I think mobility as a service has a great part to play. Not only will it generate visibility to new products and services like DRT, like car clubs or micro transport, it will also link up those transport options to provide a more holistic service than just private car ownership. MaaS will also create the benefit is it will show the volume of demand in an area so other suppliers can come in and provide further options for people that will ultimately add up into a more holistic travel option.
Thanks. Silviya, do you and CBT have a view on this, on demand responsive transport versus fixed route? Because I think your presentation, a lot of it was about fixed route and the need for reinstating or bringing in new conventional bus services.
We are supportive overall, yes, and that is because it's very difficult for local authorities to dedicate sufficient budgets to fixed route local authority supported services, especially in sparsely populated rural areas. Obviously, there isn't the sufficient demand to run fully commercial services. So local authorities then need to decide what routes they can afford to subsidize and what not. And with the pandemic's impact, when eventually the government support starts receding, that's one solution where we think local authorities should explore. So replacing local authority supported services with demand responsive services that are much more efficient to run. And I know that there's a skepticism among some users of the reliability of demand responsive services as opposed to fixed routes. But many rural areas have very low routes at the moment. So once every hour, once every 3 hours even. So demand responsive services provide much better service level as well. And if the customer experience is a positive one with intuitive platforms, with telephone booking for those that do not have smartphones, with concessionary fares being accepted, I feel like that will really drive acceptability among users as well.
Thanks. Tom, is it Ben described a mobility as a service scheme with a multiple range of transport provision in the most remote area in the UK, in the Highlands of Scotland, which, as he pointed out, is an area the size of Belgium. Do you think that poses some questions about electrification of that kind of transport provision? Or do you think that the kinds of points you've raised will actually still enable it possible to electrify some of those?
So, yeah, I mean, interesting. I think that the challenges are similar in some respects in terms of providing that charging infrastructure. And I'll give a very small example. I had an interesting experience when I went over to Malta, relatively small island. They've got a kind of a mobility service type solution over in Malta, which is all electric. And one of the challenges actually of that was actually how do you charge all the vehicles? and make sure they're constantly charged. And one of the things that we saw when I experienced that as a customer, they actually had to take off the vehicles. Sometimes people would plug them in, sometimes people wouldn't, and they almost had a group of people running around making sure these vehicles were charged. And I think the similar scenarios in other areas as well. So charging vehicles in those kind of transport systems, there is definitely some challenges there, and all the things I talked about actually in terms of some of those grid constraints and those challenges there all exist in public charging as well as they do in private charging as well. So there are definitely some challenges of when you electrify those solutions, but I'm sure that all surmountable, I guess. I think definitely.
John Carr has asked a question, which Tom, but actually I suspect Ben may have comments on this too. Could the panel comment on why gas from biodigestion, for which there's plenty of feedstocks in rural areas, receives so little attention? Gas can be used in internal combustion engines with little modification, extending vehicle lives and reducing resource costs. I just wondered whether that was an issue, obviously, beyond alongside electrification, whether that was an area that you'd looked at.
It's not one I've looked at in detail. I mean, one thing I would say is, and it's not quite the same, obviously, because I get the point around, to continue the lifespan, I guess, of existing vehicles and modifications. The one thing I would say, which is quite an interesting debate, not the same debate, but an interesting one in terms of hydrogen versus electrification in vehicles, which I know is quite a popular debate. The one thing I would say, which maybe some people know, that the great thing about electric vehicles, one of the great positives, is the fact that it's an extremely efficient transfer of energy. And that's always the challenge with something like hydrogen, where actually you're having to spend time, energy making hydrogen, and then you've got to convert that obviously back into electricity. So there are definitely electrification of transport, and certainly the smaller end vehicles, cars and vans, and I think there's still a debate out there around larger vehicles, although that seems to be shifting a bit more towards the electric now as well. I think that there's definitely some valid points around how we can extend that kind of ongoing use of existing vehicles. But I do think electric vehicles are definitely winning out, I guess, as the third of transport moving forward.
Ben, as as it were, a consumer, do you have a view on gas versus electric, and particularly the idea of gas, local gas production from biodigestion in rural areas, which is an interesting, different angle on this one, I think?
Yeah, I think it depends on whether we're talking about a closed group in terms of maybe a group of rural communities, but then the problem there tends to be the manufacturers are not incentivized to produce something just for that, because it's not going to have a very large uptake. So it would need significant government intervention, I think, to push that. I would comment on hydrogen as an example. I drive a hydrogen car at the moment, and it's fantastic as a vehicle, but there is a relatively limited number of places where I can actually put hydrogen into it, and that needs to be looked at in terms of, are we going to try and provide more places to put hydrogen in? And much as Tom was saying, is that really going to be more in those closed groups in terms of, is it going to be for HGVs and rail, or is it going to be for LCVs and possibly even cars? I would tell you, we have got a hydrogen car club in operation, and it works fantastically for those people that are around the hydrogen stations. But you have a greater anxiety for people moving away from there, is that if they're traveling a longer distance, it doesn't really work because there are no more hydrogen stations to fill up. And my guess is that will be the same for other forms of gas in localized areas.
Thanks very much. Moving on, there's a question arrived which is addressed to Silviya, but I think Ben might want to comment too. Do you think there's a trade-off, given there is limited public funding, between reinstating rail and bus, or adding to bus services, versus increasing electric vehicle provision, which may further dissuade people from public transport?
It's a very good question. I guess the question stems back to the funding available. how this is structured and whether it's ring-fenced for specific purposes. So specifically on buses, for a long time, there's been a context of diminishing budgets and managing decline locally for local authorities. But now we have a new national bus strategy for the first time, something that Campaign for Better Transport has been calling for a decade. And we're really hopeful that this will help turn things around. There's a dedicated 3 billion there to make buses better and to transform services. And hopefully that will turn the culture around in local authorities around boosting demand and seeing the bus as a way of delivering green and more sustainable transport in outside cities as well as in towns and cities as well. So and in rail also we have a new way of doing things, much transformed way of doing things with a government strategy and rail plan that's committed to growing the network as opposed to shrinking it. So again, it's about how much funding there is to achieve that, whose role it is to achieve that, and who's accountable for achieving that. While obviously we're supportive of the transition to electric vehicles, we also need to be managing vehicle use overall. So there's a role for reforming taxation and replacing VAT and fuel duty, perhaps with a new system of distance-based pricing that will then price vehicle use fairly and in a much more sustainable way, depending on the vehicle you're using, where you're using it, and how you're using that as well.
Ben, do you think there's a trade-off here on, paying for and funding conventional public transport versus EV provision, which might dissuade people from using that public transport?
I don't think there's an overly simple answer to that one. I think that it is very important that we realise we can't simply replace all of the ICE cars with electric cars and solve the problem. That doesn't work. We still have congestion and being non-sustainable. But there is a common misconception that this is the car against the bus, and that's simply not true. It's the way that cars are used, as Silviya was saying. A private car ownership where you have single occupancy journeys isn't sustainable and isn't even needed on a lot of trips. If cars are used on a pay-as-you-go basis, then that incentivizes people to use other forms of transport when they can. Car ownership means most owners feel that that is a sunk cost and they should, for want of a better expression, sweat that asset as much as they can. So they use the car to go half a mile down the road to get a newspaper, or as people have been saying in the chat functions, to go to the train station in the morning when that really isn't necessary. So it's the usage of them, and that's why we need better connectivity between different modes of transport that can provide a holistic option which actually will boost the uptake of public transport.
Thanks. We've got there's one or two other questions for Tom. A couple of people have asked questions, just clarifying some of your presentation. Are there incentives for a reduced tariff for charging at night or at off-peak times? And is a regional charging hub feasible as compared with having a charger in every home?
So yeah, to take that first one, yes. So we and many others have an off-peak tariff. So between 12 and 5 in our instance, where it's cheaper to charge. And that's relatively common, I guess, now. So yes, we have that, and many others do as well. And it does give you quite significant savings. I know for myself, just my own personal circumstances, I think it's saving about £200-300 a year. So if you are going down that EV route, I would definitely look at your tariff, depending on your consumption. So yes, absolutely, there's definitely some interesting stuff happening in that space of tariffs. And I think increasingly, actually, you'll see new tariffs come on that are smart tariffs and look at charging at different times depending on the kind of customer need. And that will also change, because the one thing we've got to be careful of is that you're going to get a new peak, right? So if everyone starts charging at 12 o'clock, then you're going to have a big peak on the grid, which is not going to be sustainable long term. So that's that's kind of one element. The other thing, just to mention, I was going to jump in on the last question actually.
Oh, sorry.
When we think about the about how we use home charging, actually, rather than just thinking about home charging as a solution for because people who buy cars. There's some interesting work we've done and others are doing in the market as well around peer-to-peer charging. So this kind of concept actually is that you install a charge point in the home, and actually that could be where other people can charge their vehicles, or potentially, in the future, is there an opportunity where some of the vehicles that the Ben and the team Enterprise run for the car clubs, maybe they're going to be parked on people's drives some of the time and charging on people's drives there. So I think there's some really interesting opportunities about how we use some of that home charging infrastructure. So in the future. And sorry, what was your second question?
Regional charging hubs as opposed to a charger in every home.
Yeah, so linking to that peer-to-peer piece, I think there's an interesting one there about actually, do we need one in every single home, or actually could we have one on, one in one place on somebody's driveway? So that's one kind of model. I think it is starting to shift a little bit in terms of charging, in terms of where the best place is to charge, particularly if you don't have a driveway where you have to rely on other methods. And it's interesting, I think, when you look at some of the ranges now. I think the ID3, the ID3 is now, I think the top of the range is 250, 300 miles, and you've got rapid charging. So you're getting to that point now where potentially customers can start to charge, and those kind of charging hubs. And anybody who's a bit of a geek in this area may have seen the big kind of forecourt EV forecourt charging forecourt over, I forgot where exactly it's now, northeast of London, that GridSurf have built. That's the kind of concept I think we'll start seeing more and more, and potentially encourages people who don't want to charge or don't want to install a charger at home to charge elsewhere. So I definitely see those hubs becoming more and more prevalent, I guess, in across the country moving forward.
Thanks, Ben. Did you want to comment on this?
I definitely agree. I think the other thing to mention is that most people, it's not about charging from 0 to full in the middle of a very long journey. So most people here, we're talking a little bit like maybe you do with your mobile phone, where you're constantly topping it up a little bit every day or every 5 minutes if it's my mobile phone. But it's a different type of charging behaviour than it is a full fueling behaviour with an ICE vehicle. But we do need to make sure that we're looking at how do we enable people, for example, that are living in flats, don't have driveways, and maybe that's workplace charging or other similar options that need to be, boosted and encouraged in other ways.
Yeah, and interestingly, there's going to be some changes this year. You're mentioning flats, where in March next year the OZEV changes the OZEV grant system will be changing, and you'll start to see a lot more. The incentivization for installing charging infrastructure in flats, because right now it's quite tricky and expensive, and that's going to be massive, right? Because there's a whole load of customers today that can't charge their vehicle and they want to charge their vehicle. So, we need to address that.
Silviya, do you have any comments on any of this? You're on mute, I think.
Sorry, no, I saw we're out of time.
We are out of time, yes. Well, look, thank you very much to Silviya, Ben and Tom. We missed one or two questions about freight outside cities, for example, and about the beaching cuts. But I'd like to thank them, Silviya and Tom and Ben, for their presentations and for answering the questions. We now move over to the second set of breakout sessions on data and on universal and inclusive transport. So thanks very much to everybody.